are started. So let's begin with prayer and we'll get right into our evening lesson. Father, we thank you for this evening. I thank you for these very precious people who have left the comforts of their home, perhaps some of them after very busy days, to make their way here this evening to be with us. I pray for those who are not able to make it, but perhaps are joining us online now with live stream. I ask that you would be with them as well as we endeavor to study your word tonight. I pray that you would capture our minds, open our ears, and prepare our hearts for your truth, and that your word might accomplish your perfect will and good pleasure concerning us this evening for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. I really have a daunting task, so I don't want to spend much time. I didn't get a chance to finish chapter 15 last week. Chapter 15 has only 35 verses. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I stopped somewhere around verses 23 or 24, maybe 25 through 30 is where I stopped. And so I'm not going to go back and reiterate too much, but I do want to kind of, because it really prepares for where Job transitions to in his response. And that's why I feel like it's important. But if you were to look, for example, at chapter 15, verses 23 through 24, you just see more of the same of the criticism and sarcasm that Eliphaz has poured out on Job, and the accusations that are being made against him. And in verses 23 through and 24, he says this. He says, he wanders, speaking of the wicked now, that's who Eliphaz is speaking of. He wanders abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is ready at his hand. And so the wicked wanders, wondering where his next meal will come from. That's what the implication is. Distress and anguish terrify him. In fact, they prevail against him. And this is retribution theology being played out. Then in verses 25 through 30, he continues, because he has stretched out his hand against God, again speaking of the wicked, and defies the Almighty, running stubbornly against him with a thickly bossed shield, because he has covered his face with his fat, and gathered fat upon his waist, and has lived in desolate cities and houses that none should inhabit, which are ready to become heaps of ruins. He will not be rich, and his wealth will not endure, nor will his possessions spread over the earth. He will not depart from darkness. The flame will dry up his shoots, and by the breath of his mouth he will depart. Now we read this whole chapter last week, and you saw, when you look at it all together, how really unkind it is. But here Eliphaz describes further the actions of the wicked man. Now note this. He says, with outstretched hand, he defies God. Look at it this way, as if someone raises his fist in defiance. That's the idea, outstretched hand against God, defies God, verse 25. Running stubbornly against him, verse 26. He has found ease in his prosperity, verse 27. By way of oppression, he has taken over cities and houses only to bring them to ruin. Verse 28. He will ultimately lose it all. Verse 29. And it ends in judgment. Verse 30. What do you think Eliphaz is hoping in giving that description? Well, he's hoping that Job will identify with those descriptions. That Job will, again, finally come to grips with the sin which they've been hoping the whole time. In fact, Durham in his commentary even goes as far as to say Eliphaz's thinking is, quote, he says, this is your condition, Job, end of quote. There's the accusation that Eliphaz is making. The repeated insinuations and innuendos are absolutely ruthless, and we talked about that extensively last week. Look at the closing verses. He says in verses 31 through 35 of chapter 15, he says, let him not trust in emptiness, deceiving himself. For emptiness will be his payment. It will be paid in full before his time, and his branch will not be green. He will shake off his unripe grape like the vine, and cast off his blossom like the olive tree. For the company of the godless is barren, who will listen, and fire consumes the tents of bribery. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil, and their womb prepares deceit. So here again, Eliphaz is painting the portrait of the end of a wicked man, which he perceives to be Job. Again, look at what he says. He trusts in worthless things. He's self-deceived, which results in emptiness, which he goes on to describe. His branch will not be green. In other words, he won't be productive. God will rid the vine of unripe grapes, which he considers the wicked in Job to be. Cast off the blossom like the olive tree. And he now explains what explain what he means. The company of the godless is barren, and fire consumes the tents of bribery. If you have an English Standard ESV Study Bible, a footnote on this verse is really interesting. I like the way the ESV Study Bible footnote puts it on page 894. It says, quote, Eliphaz mercilessly chooses vocabulary that focuses on the loss of Job's offspring as indication of God's judgment. How absolutely cruel. You got hints of that, fire consuming the tent. You see that. He's just playing on what Job has lost. Again, appealing to his retribution theology that all Job is experiencing is judgment by virtue of his unconfessed and unrepented sin. And verse 35 is just absolutely scathing. Eliphaz clearly sees Job as a sinner, deserving all that has come upon him, which he sees as divine judgment. In other words, Eliphaz sees Job as the wicked man under divine judgment, receiving everything that he deserves. You must wonder, has Eliphaz completely forgotten what he had previously witnessed in Job's life? How long, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us. How long had Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar known Job? Likely years. And in that relationship, they had undoubtedly, and we know that by hints we get through the different things that they say, they have observed behavior and conduct and character in Job, and at one time, even though it was kind of a condemnatory way, it was in a sense a commendation of reminding Job that Job had actually been a counselor to those who were suffering. Himself had offered words of encouragement, had spoken words of wisdom, and now those words had evaded him and left him. But they saw this kind of stuff in him, and yet you have to ask yourself, did they forget that? Such that now, just after sitting in silence 7 days, which prompted these 3 cycles of speeches, that they just become so disgusted with Job that they have absolutely divorced themselves from the character he's demonstrated in the past and are making these accusations against him. Whatever he knew before of Job, he is now cast to the wind and has abandoned the idea of comfort. In fact, I put it in my notes, comfort has been exchanged for condemnation. Why did they first come to Job? They came to comfort him. And it did not take them very long to abandon. It took them merely 7 days of sitting in silence, and Job being the one who breaks the silence and speaks. And then immediately after he finishes his speech, Eliphaz jumps on the bandwagon of beating Job up. And it's incessant. It hasn't stopped so far. Back in verse 8, Eliphaz asked Job, had he listened in the counsel of God. One might very well ask Eliphaz the same question: where'd you get your counsel from? He certainly believes he knows what God's doing and what is going on. The very thing he accuses Job of limiting wisdom to himself in chapter 15, verse 8b, he's guilty of doing. And he's claiming for himself wisdom, isn't he? And there was indeed a counsel, and we know that. We see that in chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 2, verse 1. But I promise you that Eliphaz knows nothing of it. Of course, neither does Job. But Eliphaz is so bound to his retribution theology, fully persuaded that he knows exactly in every situation, unequivocally, no compromise whatsoever, how God deals with wicked people and how God deals with man. To him, it's a period. We've said it over and over again, how rigid some people can be in their theology. And they might have some of their theology might be moving in the right direction and may be correct. But how do they live that theology? How do they communicate their theology? This is an example of how not to do it. Eliphaz has completely misconstrued Job's speeches, completely misunderstood him. Rather than seeing them as the result, and we'll talk about this in tonight's lesson if I get there, rather than seeing them as a result of turmoil in Job's heart, according to Estes, he sees them as a rejection of God's wisdom. He's accusing Job of rejecting God's wisdom. He totally ignores Job's internal struggle and pain. How can you do that in light of what you're seeing is going on with him? The man is sitting in ashes and dirt, sores from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, suffering intensely physically. How do you not know that there must be at least that going on the inside of him as well? Again, as Estes reminds us in his commentary on this passage, he says, quote, "The lament psalms demonstrate that godly people often have intense feelings of pain, which they bring to the Lord as they plead for His intervention in their lives." In fact, many of the psalms are what we call lament psalms, where the psalmist laments something he's going through, and he pleads for God to intervene on his behalf. So what does that prove to us? If you read the lament psalms, it says to you, guess what? The righteous suffer. And they do. And we'll see that in just a minute. So Eliphaz continues to come to the wrong conclusion regarding his friend Job, and therefore grossly misjudges him, adding only more pain and suffering to poor Job. There are many lessons for us to learn in this chapter, but I think the main one is that in our attempts to counsel others listen, let me say this very carefully. In our attempts to counsel others in hard and trying times, we must never forget, listen, church, that our knowledge of what is really going on is limited. And let us counsel with that in mind, and therefore counsel carefully and wisely. Now, look at chapter 16. Eliphaz is finished. Well, he's finished for this cycle. He comes back at least one more time in the third cycle. Now, this is Job. Job responds in chapters 16 and 17. When I sat down and began to exposit this, I was hoping I'd go through 16 and 17 together. Now you want to laugh? That's not going to happen. But look at chapter 16. Let's read these verses. Then Job answered and said, "I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do, as if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. If I speak, my pain is not assuaged. And if I forbear, how much of it leaves me? Surely now God has worn me out. He has made me desolate, all my company, had made desolate all my company. And he has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me. And my leanness has risen up against me. It testifies to my face. He has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. Men have gaped at me in their mouth, with their mouth. They have struck me insolently on the cheek. They mass themselves together against me. God gives me up to the ungodly and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with a breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin and have laid my strength in the dust. My face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry find no resting place. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me. My eyes pour out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God, as the Son of Man does with his neighbor. For when a few years have come, I shall go the way from which I shall not return. Look at chapter 17, verse 1. My spirit is broken. My days are extinct. The graveyard is ready for me. We outlined this chapter in three different outlines. Number one, verses 1 through 6, Job rebuttals Eliphaz. Verses 1 through 6, Job rebuttals Eliphaz. Verses 7 through 17, Job addresses God directly. And verses 18 through 22, Job expresses his desire for someone to advocate for his innocence before God. So Job's rebuttal, Job's addresses God directly, and Job expresses his desire for someone to advocate for his innocence before God. Consider first Job's rebuttal of Eliphaz, and by extension of you, he didn't just say comforter, a singular pronoun. He actually uses a plural pronoun, or a plural word here. He talks about all my comforters. By extension, comforters applies Bildad and Zophar. And so look what he says about them in 2a. He says, turning back over there with me, he says, miserable comforters are you all. In other words, he is in effect saying that they're worthless. They are of no value to him at all. No, he's not mincing words. In fact, the Hebrew actually reads, according to Durham in his commentary, quote, comforters of trouble are you all, end of quote. In essence, Job is telling Eliphaz that he has no skill as a comforter or a counselor. He has no words that offer anything or bring any consolation. And this is borne out in what you see in verse 3. Look at what he says here. So shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? You recall back at the opening of chapter 15, Eliphaz accused Job of doing what? Of being what? Or expressing what? Windy knowledge. And I broke that down for you. And he didn't stop with just accusing him of espousing windy knowledge. he tells Job, you're filling your belly with the east wind, and even arguing that Job's talk is unprofitable. So to express his disgust with Eliphaz, what does Job do? Job, I see it as Job returning the barb by accusing him of offering nothing but long speeches filled with windy words. In other words, this is what Job is saying, and you got to don't miss this, because now it's the contention has become intense. If Job is saying, if there's a windbag in all of this, it's you, Eliphaz. Will his words ever end? Job is exasperated with the incessant accusations and false claims that have been leveled against him. Something has provoked Eliphaz to speak to Job this way, and Job asked, what is it? Not that he expected to receive an answer. Look at verses 4 and 5. He said, I also could speak as you do if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. So in other words, what if the circumstances were different? What if they were reversed? What if Eliphaz and either of the three of them were in Job's place? Job makes it known that he could very well return the favor by speaking to them the same way. He could speak accusatorily. He could speak derogatorily or sarcastic to them. He could make all kinds of claims. He could even shake his head, which likely he's watched them do. You can only imagine at times when Job has been speaking, you can see three guys just doing this, like, shaking their head at him or expressing their disdain for what Job is saying. Job says, I could shake my head at you just as you have done to me. But then again, Job could, as we often say, take the high road, which is what he implies here. Rather than accuse and condemn them, Job's mouth could do what? Could provide much needed strength, and his lips could provide much needed solace. It's Job's way of saying, and this would have been nice for this coming from you, but it didn't. In order to assuage their pain, in other words, lessen their suffering, rather than aggravate their suffering, Job claims his words would have been chosen to mitigate their pain. That's, who knows if Job would have really done that. Because up to this point, what theology did Job hold to too? He held pretty tenacious to his retribution theology. His theological chain has been jerked big time by what he's been going through. I think he's probably seeing himself in probably a positive light here. Now, if this was reversed and you were in my place, I'd be comforting you. Well, Job, do you remember when they came to you, they intended to comfort as well? But he at least claims that that's what he would do. Look at verse 6. He says, if I speak, my pain is not assuaged. And if I forbear, how much of it leaves me? Every time Job has opened his mouth, there's been no lessening of his pain and suffering. His pain and suffering have not been alleviated in the slightest by anything that he said or anything that's been said to him. If he sits in silence, his suffering continues. If he opens his mouth to speak, his suffering not only continues, but then is preyed upon, P-R-E-Y-E-D, preyed upon by his so-called friends or comforters. He's between what I call the proverbial rock and a hard place. Darned if you do and darned if you don't. If I sit silent, my pain continues. If I speak, my pain continues. So what do you sense in that? What do you hear in that statement? You sense Job's frustration and again his hopelessness. I mean, it's real frustration that it's like saying, what do I do? There's just no reprieve here. In my affliction, there's no reprieve, none whatsoever. And so he's through basically addressing Eliphaz. And now in verses 7 through 17, he addresses God directly. And pay close attention, because when I get to the theological summary of this at the end, which I don't think I'll ever get to tonight, I don't know what, that clock must race when I start. But look at verses 7 through 9. He says, surely now God has worn me out. He has made desolate all my company. He has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me. And my leanness has risen up against me. It testifies to my face. He has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. All right, listen very carefully, because this is where you need to pay very close attention. Those are strong words. Who is he talking about? Talking about Yahweh. He's talking about God. And this is a staggering passage. In verse 7, he unequivocally, and I'm going to move slowly, unequivocally sees God as the source of his, quote, being worn out. God has worn him out. That's how he sees it. God has placed Job, according to Job himself, in this place where his strength has been absolutely exhausted. And if that wasn't significant enough, even those who came to comfort him, his company, are desolate, which he again sees as God's doing. Meaning, what does it mean my company is desolate? Meaning that they offer absolutely no solace whatsoever. They're worthless counselors. Job sees himself. Here is how Job sees himself. He sees himself standing entirely alone. What a hard place to be. In fact, earlier, his own wife failed to offer him any consolation. If you were to go back to chapter 2, verse 9, she tells him to do what? Curse God and die. So he doesn't even have his wife standing beside him to encourage him. She's told him to curse God and die so his suffering would end. His friends have come and they just added insult to injury. And he feels like he's standing here alone. He sees God as the source of this. God is the one who has brought him to this point. I don't want you to forget that, because again, when we get to the theological emphasis and what it teaches us here, you'll understand something. That's a negative and a positive, what you just saw. And I'll express how that's the case. Verse 8, Job goes so far as to say that God has touched his body, shriveled him up. He's been reduced to little more than just a skeleton, which he perceives as a witness against him to all who see him as a deserving sinner, that which his three fans have repeatedly accused him of. In other words, he's saying, I'm sitting here, I'm shriveled up no more than a skeleton. As people walk by me, they must be looking at me and saying, wow, what a wicked person he must be to suffer in this manner. Deserving. Here is all they need, Job feels, to warrant their strict adherence to the retribution principle. They will undoubtedly, and in fact do, see him as a wicked transgressor. Although he does not see himself this way, his conscience testifies the very opposite to him of what they accuse him of. I got an asterisk here in my notes, which usually means I'm getting ready to say something I want us to consider personally. Imagine if you can, dealing with incessant accusations and condemnation from without, while everything inside shouts that's not true. Just imagine being surrounded by friends or people who claim to be your friends and comforters who are railing accusations against you, trying to explain what it is that you're going through, and you know inside of yourself they're not speaking a word of truth. That's Job's struggle. And what a hard struggle that is. And then verse 9. I mean, just verse 9 is, again, it just takes the breath away from you. Think about it. He sees the wrath of God as the source of his suffering. He sees God's wrath as the source of the apparent hostility that he's experienced. In fact, again, Estes, and I quote him a lot because he does such a wonderful job of expositing this and teaching the text. Estes comments, quote, "The vivid language Job uses describes God as assailing him. That is, hating or bearing a grudge against him," end of quote. That's how Job sees this. He hates me. Think about, can you imagine getting to a point where you feel as though God hates you and that God is assailing you? I mean, during study, I got to tell you, there's just times I stop and I have to step away from the text for just a few minutes because I have to really come to grips and work through things just like this. I mean, how one can hardly fathom the depth of despair of a person who is at that point and sees God in that light. What a horrible place to be. It's one thing to think of God's actions towards those who are truly the wicked. But even when we see God's actions being executed toward those who are truly wicked, are we not, even in that case, moved oftentimes with compassion? Does not our heart break when we see even the wicked suffer because we empathize with them? We're flesh like them. It's one thing to think of God's actions toward those who are truly the wicked, but Job has for the moment blamed God for the action that is being taken against him. I don't even know how to verbalize this. I wonder what it must have been like in heaven as God listens to this. Verse 10. Men have gaped at me with their mouth. They have struck me insolently on the cheek. They mass themselves together against me. Job here interjects the actions of men against him. Kind of in the midst of blaming God, now he interjects the actions of men. Job may very well be describing others besides his three friends that surround him at present. Job is not, we picture it as just Job and his three buddies, and they're somewhere out in isolation, when in reality it could very well be Job is on a road, a path, and others have been passing by. And others have held their nose and looked at him with disdain and seen his suffering and made comments and derogatory statements and even perhaps jeered him. That's why the implication here is he may even be referring to men who at one time were envious of his prosperity. Everybody likely knew Job, and now they see him in this condition. So they were at one time envious of his prosperity, but now gloat in the fact that he's ruined. There's that man that had all those riches. Look at him now. Nevertheless, Job expresses the demeaning actions taken against him in his suffering or in affliction. But look at verse 11. He says, God gives me up to the ungodly and cast me into the hands of the wicked. Who allowed this? In Job's estimation. What we read in verse 10, that is, God. All this, according to Job, has come upon him by God's providence. Look at verses 12 through 14. He says, I was at ease and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surrounded me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. What a vivid language. He breaks me with breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. You know what? I wrote it here, and I'm going to read it exactly as I wrote it. And here's what I wrote in my notes. Quite frankly, I'm grossly uncomfortable even commenting on these verses, period. That's how startling they are to me as I read them. How cautious you must be when approaching something like that. All I'll say is this. Job sees what he is going through as God dealing with him as he would his enemies. He sees at this point his affliction as God's dealings and employs vivid wording to describe it. And the commentaries were full of explanations in regard to what each of those descriptions meant, and they were something. Verses 15 through 17. I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin and have laid my strength in the dust. My face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. Job describes his own conduct in his affliction. In verse 15, Job speaks of having sewn sackcloth on his skin. I found it interesting, and this was not just by a few, by several, that interpret this or see this to mean that Job, in his sad physical state, could not simply don clothes. He just couldn't get dressed and put on clothes. Well, the boils, in fact, one commentator, a Hebrew scholar, actually he was breaking down the Hebrew word pictures and things, equates what Job may be experiencing as elephantitis, the swelling of his body parts and things like that, his legs. But they believe this literally means that Job has wrapped himself in sackcloth and sewn it together to make his clothes. What he couldn't put on, he's wrapped himself in sackcloth and has actually sewn it together to try to cover his body. Now, sackcloth is not silk. It's like burlap. And it's rough. You've got oozing boils that you're wrapping in sackcloth and sewing it just to hide your nakedness. Likely to just try to hide the putrid sores that are covering your whole body. If this is the case, and some of them really believe that that's a way of explaining it, and they could be right. If this is the case, imagine doing this while suffering the sores that cover his physical frame. And then he goes on to say, he speaks of laying his strength in the dust. And what that means is all his strength is just being absorbed by the ground. He continues to cover himself with dust and ashes from head to toe. Verse 16, his weeping has been so extensive, his face is reddened. How many times do you ask someone when you see them who you know has been weeping, why are your eyes red? Why is your face so red? Well, you know they've been weeping. You're just asking. In fact, his eyes are so weakened by the weeping. He says that they look like eyes of death. Deep darkness. Looking in his eyes is like looking into the deepest gloom. A man who has just wept and wept and wept and wept to the point that tears can hardly come anymore, and his eyes just sink and they're deep and they're dark. That's where he is. What must Job's appearance have been like? But this is what his friends looked on daily, causing their contempt to grow. From their perspective, they were looking on an unrepentant hypocrite in the throes of divine judgment or retribution. But this is not how Job saw himself, is it? Verse 17. What does Job do in verse 17? He yet again claims his own innocence. Even though there is no violence in my hands, I've never struck out at anybody in violence. Remember the descriptions that Eliphaz leveled at him in chapter 15 of having taken cities and ruined them, brought them to ruin, made them desolate. That's what he's accused Job of. Job is saying here, there's no violence in him. I've not done such a thing as that. My prayer, he says, is pure. Over and over again, have we not seen Job appeal to his own blamelessness? Is Job deceived about his blamelessness? Trick question. Is Job deceived about his blamelessness? No. Go read chapters 1 and 2. Consider my servant Job, Yahweh says. He is blameless in my sight and upright before me. God has already given that testimony concerning him. Job sees himself, in a sense, the way God sees him. But don't miss the last phrase. In spite of how he misconstrues the source of his affliction, thinking it is God, what is that part where he says, my prayer is pure? What does that tell us? He just finished these tremendously powerful verses in basically bringing accusation against God for what he's going through. And then yet he tells us, what does he continue to do in spite of it? Pray. You can't help it. He can't help it because the bottom line is, where is his faith? Even at this point, where is his faith? In God. That's the amazing thing through all of this. Here's Job's abiding faith and trust in Yahweh. My prayer is pure. I'm praying. If anyone could say all I can do is pray, or all I can do now is pray, it was Job. Rather than curse God and die as his wife had proposed, Job still prays, and he does so in earnest. And that's what it means when he says, my prayers are pure. In other words, I'm praying in earnest. You can imagine, as we've said earlier in another chapter, Job actually asked God, reveal to me if there is any hidden sin in me. Show me. Is that like a man who's trying to hide something? Who says to God, show me if it's there, I want to know? Verses 18 through 22. He says, O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry find no resting place. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me. My eye pours out tears to God. There's another action of faith. That he would argue the case of a man with God, as the Son of Man does with his neighbor. For when a few years have come, I shall go the way from which I shall not return. Back in Genesis 4, think about how he opens verse 18. We talked about, O earth, cover not my blood. Something should have rung in your mind when you read that. Back in Genesis chapter 4, in verse 8, beginning in verse 8, we are given the record of Cain killing his brother Abel. In verse 10 of Genesis 4, the Lord asked Cain this question, what have you done? And then the Lord answers by saying, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Abel's blood, the blood of the innocent, cried out for justice. Now, what does that have to do with what Job is saying here? Job's appeal here, listen, Job's appeal here is for the earth not to merely absorb his blood, believing that he may soon die, but rather allow it, like that of Abel's, to cry incessantly as the innocent seeking for justice. That even after his death, his blood will still speak of his blamelessness. Verse 19, but Job is still alive. And while living, he holds out the hope that there is a witness on his behalf in heaven. Someone there will mediate his case, testify for him. Again, Estes brings out the reality that unbeknown to Job at this time is the fact that Yahweh has already done this. Who has testified on his behalf already in heaven? God has already done this. Yahweh has spoken on his behalf against Satan. We saw this in the prologue, verse 20. Once again, Job describes his friend's actions against him and his subsequent response. Notice, however, he says, who he says he pours his tears out to, God. Yet again, we see Job's faith in Yahweh. Here's what I see this, and I kind of wrote this and put an exclamation point in my notes. All the swing of emotions that Job is going through here. Just can imagine waves taking him all over the place emotionally, and the affliction and suffering he's going through. Job, like a pit bull, refuses to let go of Yahweh. That speaks volumes. He refuses to let go. That's all he has. And he knows it. How much that speaks to us when we're going through something, when there seems to be nothing, we have nothing to hold on to, nothing that secures us. Where are you going to go? You go where you should have been the whole time. To him. Verse 21, again, refers to his advocate in heaven, that he would argue his case with God like men do among themselves. Job doesn't know who this advocate may be, but he's just hoping that there's someone there. As New Testament believers, aren't we glad we know that we have an advocate? We have a mediator between God and man. It is the man Jesus Christ. Job didn't have that revelation. But he's holding out hope that there's someone there that can advocate his cause. Verse 22, the closing verse. Job senses the end of his life approaching. I find it interesting, though, that Job uses the phrase, when a few years have come. At times he has expressed, and actually will here, in verse 17, chapter 17, verse 1. At times he expressed that he felt his life was in imminent danger of fleeing. However, the point to note is not the thought of physical death itself, but Job's fear that when his time does come, whenever that is, his innocence will die with him and he'll never be vindicated. If Job were to drop dead right there on the spot right now, what would his friends walk away saying? He was died a wicked person. And he feels like he'd be totally unvindicated in his blamelessness. He'd be gone forever. He didn't have the revelation we have of resurrection, not in the way that we have it. He continues this thought in chapter 17, verse 1, which is why I read it. In fact, some commentators believe that 17:1 needs to be at the end of chapter 16. They just haven't done it that way in our English translation. When he says, my spirit is broken, my days are extinct, the graveyard is ready for me. And in fact, here he speaks of the imminence of his death. He sees himself as one who is dying, one foot in the grave, you might say. Chapter 17, verse 1 is Job's expression of feeling as though he can take no more. Now, this is important, and I got to do this in 8 minutes. Actually, technically, it's 11 minutes. Here's a theological summary, which I've been building up to, that I want you to make sure you get. In verses 7 through 14, Job says some startling things about God and the way he is being treated as he sees it by God. While Job's comments, the product of his intense suffering and affliction, are a misrepresentation of God. I want you to recognize that. As well as a complete misunderstanding of his suffering, there is something we dare not miss. Job still holds tenaciously to his belief in Yahweh. He believes Yahweh is sovereign over all things. How do we know this is true? Anthony Salvaggio in his book points out, quote, "It is possible to understand even Job's bad attitude as an act of faith because," and listen to what he says, "because Job never lost his faith in God. If Job had cursed the random forces of the universe or the false gods of the nations surrounding him, then Job would have displayed that he had lost his faith in the one true God," end of quote. But where does he look? The whole time, he still looks to God. Even though it's a misrepresentation, who is he still looking? He's not looking, he didn't start blaming it on Satan. He didn't start blaming it on the false gods of the nations. He blames what he's going through on God. Misrepresentation indeed, but where's his attention? On God. He continues. He never doubts even for a moment that God is the only true God. He never doubts God's sovereignty. It is actually his belief in the one true God and his sovereignty that leads him to the mischaracterization of God. End of quote. In fact, Estes picks up the same point when he comments, quote, "Job believes in one God who is sovereign over all life. Thus, when faced with severe adversity, Job is compelled to trace his problems back to the ultimate cause in God himself," end of quote. Again, Salvaggio, quote, "In blaming God, Job is also confessing his belief that God is in charge of whatever comes to pass." Do we believe that? Oh, we say that, and we do. We call that the providence of God. It's easy to say it until you're right in the midst of it. It's easy, let me say that, when we are in the midst of the kind providence of God, it's easy for us to smile and say, "I believe in the providence of God." Everything's going wonderful, right? And then all of a sudden, things change. And we find ourselves in the hard providence of God. And then we have to say it. It's those words are hard passing our lips. This is, in theological terms, the doctrine of the providence of God. Although, I'm almost done. Although he mischaracterizes God, listen to this. Job refuses to compromise or diminish God's sovereign power or accuse God of evil. He never says God is not good. He doesn't say that. In fact, I'm reminded of a conversation. Remember when Justin Peters was here years ago, those who were with us, he showed a clip between Benny Hinn and Miles Monroe. Miles Monroe is dead now. And they were, here you have two, sadly, charismatic heretics. And Miles Monroe said, while God possesses the power, He does not possess the authority. Now, we saw that video on the videotape, didn't we? That interview actually was on the videotape that Justin showed us. He showed us that clip. While God possesses the power, He does not possess the authority. And then Benny asked him, but then where does He get the authority? And he said, He gets the authority from us. How do you think Job would have responded to that? So he's not going to compromise or diminish God's sovereign power or God's providence. He's not going to say that God is not good. And yet, neither is he willing to plead guilty to sin he hasn't committed. This puts Job in a hard place, doesn't it? He has to somehow align his personal experiences with his belief in God's character and God's sovereign rule. We now see, and this is my last couple of paragraphs here, the reason Job appeals to my witness in heaven. Christians, we all know, as we well know, Christians are not exempt from pain and suffering. When we face these things, they pose for us deep and troubling theological questions, don't they? If we're honest, that are not easily dismissed, nor are they easily answered. There are times when believers are not too far separated from Job's conundrum. We're not. Here's my conclusion. Job's attitude is wrong. His accusations were not true in many ways. His mistaken perception of God was being shaped by his experience. All warning signs for us. But what do we learn of Job's heart here? Christopher Ashe has written it's a small book, but it's just like he writes anyway. It's just so rich he's written a small kind of devotional commentary on Job. But he wrote these words. He says, quote, when we listen to Job's speeches, we need to bear in mind the distinction between Job's perception and Job's heart. That's an interesting perspective. He continues, his heart is the heart of a believer, which is why the Lord commends and affirms him at the end of this book. That's why God confirms him and commends him at the end of the whole book. God does that. How can God do that at the end of all this? How can God? Because God knew Job's what? Heart. He is a real believer. We hear in these speeches the honest grapplings of a real believer with a heart for God as he sees what he thought was a secure worldview crumble around him. And I thought, boy, is that not where we are today? We are in the midst of watching a worldview we were very comfortable with completely collapse. In fact, I'm going to be so bold as to say I think the cooking's already done. We're just being taken out of the oven. It's done. It's a done deal. They're just giving it to us a little bit at a time. So, and they're finding out how easily people acquiesce to it. Job will continue to say things, even in his next few speeches, that are wrong from a misguided disposition. He'll even say inappropriate things. But never forget, these are all the product of his suffering. Coming from a man who still holds a tenacious faith in Yahweh. I can't believe I finished that tonight. But I raced through it. Let's pray. Father, I think of your words as you spoke in the opening of this book, even though the context of, in light of where they were spoken in conversation with Satan, still are captivating words when you ask, have you considered my servant Job? And that's, in a sense, what we are doing. We are considering your servant. We see very clearly that your servants suffer. We see the struggles of their suffering. We see the frailty of our understanding, of even our perception of things. And yet we are encouraged throughout all of it by that tenacious faith that Job holds in God. Teach us from Job's experience that might very well at some time become likely our own experience. That we too might, above all things, be found faithful and finish well for our eternal benefit, but most of all for your eternal glory. In Jesus' name, amen.